Hello and welcome to our webinar on the Master Control Validation Excellence tool and our Validation Excellence methodology. My name is Erin Wright. I'm the Validation Product Manager for Master Control, and I'm really excited to share with you our new risk-based validation methodology and tool to help streamline your validation documentation. Our Validation Excellence tool, or VxT, lives on our customer website. And I'm going to talk you through the methodology and the variables that we're going to review with you while we go through the tool together. So I am logged into our customer website. Under our Solutions tab, you can see our Validation Excellence tool. And so if we click here, it will take me to my Validation Excellence tool landing page. And this walks you through our risk-based validation approach. Risk-based validation is a process by which we assign risk to different components or processes to determine what is truly high risk for a company and what requires a higher level of validation than others. This approach was not developed entirely by Master Control in a bubble. We worked really extensively with industry experts, including former FDA officials, to come up with this methodology to help streamline your validation documentation and overhead. So Janice Olson, who from EduQuest was a former director of IT for the FDA, was heavily involved in the development of this tool and the methodology. So the first thing that you'll do is select the product version. If you are premise hosted or cloud annual, you'll select our annual release. In this case, it's 11.7. If you are a cloud quarterly, you'll select the quarterly release. And the first time you do an assessment, you do a full assessment of all the components. I've done some data setup, so we have my assessment status as continue assessment. But in most cases, in your case, it'll start with start your assessment. Now, I'm also a system administrator on the customer website for Master Control, which you must also be for your company to be able to perform a risk assessment. If you're a regular user on the customer website, you won't be able to perform a risk assessment using VxT. You would receive an error message here that would guide you towards asking your sysadmin to perform the task. So we'll go into the risk assessment. So now that we have selected our 11.7 version, we'll be able to select which modules we are planning on using for Master Control. I've selected Documents and Portal as our test data, but it's whatever modules that you're planning on using. You must assess the risk for Portal since everyone uses the Portal module. There is a large caveat. Process forms are not included as part of VxT. If you have our out-of-the-box solutions packages, eForm Builder, solutions modifications forms, those will follow our traditional validation approach. On the VxT, we have our link here to view release notes. This will take you to the release notes page for the selected version. In this case, 11.7, to show you the new enhancements and defects that were provided for 11.7. The first time you use VxT, you perform a full risk assessment on all of the predetermined components from Master Control within that module. This gives you a baseline risk to assess against, so that then as we go through change control and through upgrade, we can then look at that specific delta. And so the initial risk assessment is a higher level risk assessment that doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of coding changes. So the first time you use it, it doesn't matter if you're a new client or if you're an upgrade, everyone gets the same initial baseline risk assessment calculation and components. The Need Help link here takes you to our customer ServiceNow portal where you can log a ticket and get a little bit of help from our technical support team on how to use the tool. We have a filter, and that allows you to filter the components themselves. An enhancement for the future is that we're going to start filtering other columns, but for now, it's just going to cover the components. So, new documentation that Master Control has started providing to clients in support of VxT is our best practice configuration specifications. These document the master control recommended configurations for each of the modules. So we have a best practice approval route, for example, that we say for most industries, for most document types, this approval routing for new SOPs is what we've seen work best for our clients. Now, some people may make changes to that for their business processes, but we have a best practice route. We have best practice roles, best practice info card type and subtype, and all the recommendations from the master control configuration consultants on how best to set up your software for scalability and usability. We have now documented those as part of specifications that you have access to and that you can review. These are downloaded on our customer website. They're under our Solutions Product Download page. So if we go to Solutions Product Downloads, the same place that you download your TOQ documents. So you select the 11.7 version and you can download all of the best practice specifications for these modules listed here. You'll notice that we also include our cloud offerings, so registrations. If you have eTMF Manager, that is included as one of the components of studies. So Master Control's risk-based validation approach, our validation excellence methodology, is unique and best because not only does it take into account software risk of what Master Control feels the risk of a component is, but it also takes into account client risk. And so the FDA not only recommends but strongly encourages the use of risk-based validation for your risk assessments. It's not enough to just review the software risk. You have to look at how you're using the software and how that impacts any regulations that apply to you. You know, it doesn't matter if we don't consider it risky if you're using collaboration, one-step collaborations to document approvals. That's not the way the software is intended to use, and that your usage may be a higher risk than Master Control may have assessed. And so it's very important and part of the FDA recommendations on risk-based validation to not just look at software risk, but also client usage risk. And that's what we built VxT in mind. So each of our modules are broken down into individual components. And these are determined by our Master Control product owners of the components of each of the modules that are client-facing that should be reviewed. The Master Control software risk is determined by the internal team, and we're assessing our software risk on the initial assessment, our baseline risk assessment, on 3 levels. We look at, is this component part of the Master Control best practice specifications? Approval routing is. We highly recommend that you use approval routing as part of your configurations, is that you have controlled document reviews and sign-offs prior to having a procedure become effective. So approval routing is highly integrated as part of our best practices. Not all of our components are. For example, controlled copies is not highly integrated as part of our best practices. Certainly you have the controlled copies tab on your info cards, and then you're able to export PDFs of the main files on your documents, but it's not part of the best practice everyday usage, how we recommend you set up the software. And so you'll see that different components have different levels of risk associated to them based upon how well integrated they are into our best practice configuration specifications. And again, those can be downloaded from our customer website. The second risk that we review is impact of failure. How bad is your day if approval routes fail? And I would say your day is pretty bad. That's a pretty high risk area. You want to make sure that your documents are getting approved and flow along the predetermined, pre-configured approval route appropriately. And then we look at our mitigations of how well have we tested approval routing internally at Master Control as part of our OQ operational qualification, or as we call it, our vendor functional testing. And what degree of mitigation do we see for each of these components as part of our OQ testing? Now, if you forget what any column is measuring, there is a hover feature that if you simply place your mouse over the column header, it will show you what the column is measuring. And that can help guide you as you go through each of the components and columns. So that's just the master control software at risk. That's what we think internally at master control the software risk might be. What's most important in VxT is this client risk assessment of how you're using our software. So the first column here is our variation or variance from best practice. And it's a sliding scale from 0 to 5. And so if you're directly in line with our best practice, if our best practice configuration specification looks exactly like your import sheet, this might be a 0. If you made some minor tweaks here or there, we might consider this a low variance. But we're basically measuring how different is your configuration than what we recommend you use, of how you use the software. The next column is our regulatory sensitivity. This, again, is a sliding scale from 0 to 5 and for you to enter based upon your company's regulations that apply to your industry, your product, if you're a blood lab, your state regulations, of what regulatory or regulations apply to you and how are they impacted by using master control. So obviously approval routing and controlled document management is going to have high regulatory sensitivity. It's directly mentioned in multiple regs of having controlled document procedures. But if you might say that this might only have a medium regulatory sensitivity based upon your industry and the regulations that apply to you. So this is all subjectively based upon the regulations that apply to you and your industry and not master control's assessment of Part 11 or Annex 11 or 820 or 8 and any of the regulations that we might feel. This is fully defined by the client and your usage and how you're using the software. The master control guidance risk is just a guidance on what we think the client risk assessment might be. And so kind of help give an approach of what you might consider for your client risk assessment. The client risk assessment is a gut feeling, subjective, how risky do you think this is, just based on your experience, whether it's with other vendors, whether it's with master control during an upgrade, whether it's any subjective gut feeling of, I just want to make sure that approval routings work. And that's because that's so important to me, and I just want to weight this to be a higher risk. That's where you do it in our client risk assessment. And the client risk assessment is the place to add that gut feeling when it comes to things. You can certainly always stay with the master control guidance risk, but this is your subjective section to determine subjective risk, and we wanted to kind of capture that gut feeling somehow. The next column here is our TPQ mitigations, a new documentation that we have put in place starting in 11.7 are our TPQ protocols. We have started writing and executing usage testing for each of our standard modules based upon our best practice specifications. So we're performing usage testing and user testing scenarios of in the documents module. It's creating a document info card and taking it through its life cycle, approval, rejection, revision, periodic review, obsolescence, et cetera, et cetera. And that testing and that usage testing and user scenarios are based entirely from our best practice specifications. So you'll notice that our TPQ mitigation, while pre-populated, is editable. And the purpose for that is that if your variance from best practice is very high, if what you're doing is nothing like we recommend that you do, you'll want to reset your TPQ mitigation. Because if your variance from best practice is very high, the coverage of the TPQ testing is probably pretty low. Because again, the TPQ testing is tied directly to the variants from best practices. But that's for you to determine that what level do you feel that the TPQ testing covers your actual usage configuration of the software. So we'll pre-populate it based upon what we tested as part of our best practices. But it is an editable field for you and your team to include. This gives us our overall client risk score. And our client risk score is adding our variance from best practice, regulatory sensitivity, client risk assessment, and then including our TPQ mitigation, which gives us our overall client risk score. We then add our software risk and client risk score to come up with our overall risk score, and then a recommendation if client-specific usage testing should occur. In most cases, if you are close and using our best practices, you can accept our internal TPQ testing as your user testing. In the events where you're highly varied from our best practices, we'll recommend that you do user testing on your site just to make sure that your procedures and your processes are in place and work for you based upon your configuration. And so we recommend that you go through each of the components, and I'll just put in some data here to help move us along, and review each of the components listed based upon your usage and configuration. You always have to assess Portal. It's all required, but because it's such a long module, we fill that out ahead of time for you. If you have multiple modules in place, you can always collapse the tables. And so you won't have a very long scrolling through. You can only have whichever one you're working on at a time. Now, what's important is that VxT is done at a company level in the system. And so let's say you have 3 sysadmins who are sysadmin users on our customer website, and one of them starts a risk assessment. Any of the other 2 can log in and work on that risk assessment as well. So we have 1 risk assessment per company per version. And you'll go through and do your assessments on that measure. You can go back through and modify assessments if there's changes that you want to make to it, or if you want to completely start over after you've completed your assessment, you can go ahead and delete your assessment and start over from scratch. A nice thing about the tool is if I select our projects module and I start assessing it, and I say, you know what, we're never really going to use projects. I can remove it from my selected modules and it disappears from my assessment. But let's say we change our mind, we have a fickle implementation plan, it saves my data. And so I don't have to go back through and fully reassess, it saves what I worked on previously, that I can just start up exactly where I left off. Now you'll notice, now that all 3 of my modules have been assessed, I have this continue to step 2 button now becomes enabled. When we enable that, we come here to upload our logo. And what this allows you to do is upload a logo to import into your document. One of the greatest features of the Validation Excellence tool, in my opinion, is the ability to export all of the data that we have entered through VxT on the customer website into a Word document to then route for approval. It saves a lot of document creation time. We have a formal template that populates with your customer name and your customer logo and all of your specific data through the form. And all you need to do is then send it through an email for approval, print it out if you're not using master control for your validation documents, and route that for approval, or you can put it in master control and route it that way. If I select use my logo, and we had our master control logo pre-populated, I get a nice preview of what my document's going to look like. And as I scroll down, I can export file, and it'll export the document as a Word file for me. You can see that it populates with my logo and the version that I've selected from VxT. And it also populates my company name throughout. The template includes the scope of the modules that were selected, definitions of each of the components, what was measured there, and then goes through a deeper dive of what each of the calculations looks for, what they're considered, and what's considered low, medium, or high for each of the settings. It then takes the tables that we have completed through VxT and exports them into the tool. Now these are not editable. I couldn't go through and make a change to this if I wanted to. What I would do is I would go back into the tool and select Modify Assessment, and then I could go through and make any changes and re-export it. We wanted to make sure that the data that we had in our master control site matched the data that you have in your document exports. Now in my version of Word, any sections that can be edited are highlighted in yellow. And so if I wanted to add comments to kind of explain why I considered the review step to have a low variance in best practice, or if there was any ratings that I thought, let me explain this to make it a little bit more clear as to what I was looking for, you can add those into your comments beneath the table. The best part of this document, in my personal opinion, is our validation recommendation summary. This goes through and pulls out each of the components that we determined additional testing would be recommended for. And so what you would do is that you would take this table and either give it to your internal validation expert to write your configuration-specific usage scripts against, or you can give this table to a master control validation consultant, and we'll write usage testing scripts for you on your configuration based upon these items. And so this helps consolidate and streamline the information for the document. You can also review our version history here. You can see that our internal team has been playing with VxT. And it just includes a kind of a revision of all the different changes that were captured and which sysadmins worked on the document and the tool. And so then you could print this and route this through for approval through VxT. Now this is for your initial assessment only, and VxT is available for our premise, hosted, and cloud clients. Originally, when we presented this tool and the methodology to our clients during our October summit, we received a lot of very passionate feedback that our premise and hosted clients would love to use this tool, and that it's just simply not fair that it's only available to cloud. And we agreed, and so now VxT is available to all of our clients, premise, hosted, cloud, etc. So our premise and hosted clients will only be able to assess against 11.7 because that is our current annual release. Our cloud quarterly clients would assess against 2017 too, since that is their current active version of master control. We will be having phase 2 of VxT, which is our change control methodology, coming out with the 2018-1 software release. The change control methodology allows us to have a much deeper and more technical dive into what's changed between versions than the initial assessment. So the initial assessment is more of a high-level baseline risk assessment. Change control gives us a beginning and end point to review the delta of what has actually changed in the code. Since on initial assessment, you could be a brand new client coming in on 11.7, it could be a client upgrading from version 10 to 11.7, or from 11.2 to 11.7. And there was just so many different variables with the first time you use it that we determined a baseline risk where you just do an overall usage assessment is best for the first time you use it. And then in change control, we can only review the enhancements and defects and really what's changed in the code from your initial assessment. So our software calculation is different in change control because we can have a much deeper dive. We're going to review things like cyclomatic complexity of code, basically how many different logic branches is there within a single feature. We'll look at the size of the coding change, literally how many lines of code did we have to write to make this new feature. We'll also look at the function calls, or how integrated is this new feature across the software. Is this something that is documents module specific, or is this something that's like an Explorer that is integrated with multiple modules? And so we'll have these multiple code as these multiple variables assigned and assessed by our development team when they're coding the features. So this risk assessment process begins at the very beginning of our new features and enhancements creation, and that'll be exported into the tool, and then we'll review the client usage changes that may be impacted with these new enhancements. We'll have a separate webinar to walk through change control in more detail once the functionality is ready. It'll be available for use and released with our 2018-1 release. VxT can only begin on version 11.7. So if you are on 11.6 or 11.5 or any of our earlier versions, you can't use VxT. We have new documentation that we released as part of this validation excellence methodology and tool that we've only started creating in 11.7. And so you have to at least be on 11.7 to use VxT. And so if you, as of that documentation, if you go to our solutions tabs and product downloads, and select the version of the software that you are implementing, our product documentation is where you can find the TPQ test protocols. And these are the executed test protocols. And the best practice specifications are available under the validation documents tab. Both of these documents have gone through our formal quality approval flow. So they've had pre-approval, validation and quality review, and then validation and quality approval post-execution. And so these have been routed through our master control approval process as controlled documents. We will create new best practice configuration documents and new executed TPQ protocols with every release of the software. This way, as new enhancements get created and integrated into our best practices, we have documented recommendations on the best usability and scalability configurations out there. And that we have usage testing documented for every module for every release. And so that new clients coming in will be able to leverage the usage testing. As we have new enhancements and new best practices, we'll update the usage scripts to better test and map to those enhancements based upon how they are integrated into our best practice configuration specifications. That is our validation excellence methodology and tool in a nutshell. Hope that this has been a beneficial presentation for you, and please reach out to your CSR if you have any other questions or concerns. Thank you so much for your time. Hi, and hopefully you enjoyed that presentation on VxT. Now we will take some questions that came in during the call. So one of the questions that came in is the first time you can use VxT on 11.7, or will we have it available for previous versions? And unfortunately, no. VxT was implemented on 11.7, so upgrade to at least 11.7 and then carry that through. And it's just the best practices in the TPQ testing began with the 11.7 iteration. We will be having VxT initial assessments and change controls from every version from 11.7 on. Another question that came in, do I have to be a sysadmin on the customer website to use this, or can anyone on my team use it? You do have to be a sysadmin on the customer website to access the VxT. What we have found with a lot of our customers using this is that the sysadmin, who has sysadmin rights for a customer website, sets up a conference room, sets up a WebEx, and they call a meeting. The validation team comes together, and they all work around. They display the screen on a projector, and then work around together as a team under one person's login. How long does this typically take to go through? The best answer to that is it depends. It depends on the company, your familiarity with master control. We have found, and how many chefs you have in the kitchen. Companies with a very strong understanding of the master control components tend to breeze through it pretty quickly. They know what they're using, they know how they're using it. And some others who aren't quite as familiar with master control end up pausing to review what the components are, what they mean, and if they know that they're using it or not. So on average, what I've seen for, say, a documents training portal assessment, about 2 hours. I've had clients go through every module in 4 hours, and I've had clients that took 2 days to go through portal. But mostly, I see about 2 hours for docs training portal. Does the template that is created download in Word? And if so, can we edit the document after downloading it? Yes, it does get exported out into a Word document. We do have the template locked down against editing because we wanted the data in the VxT to always match the data that you are routing and approving for approval. You can always go back in and modify the assessment if there was a rating or a score that needed to be updated after review. We do have comment sections and sections of the Word template that can be edited. So if you wanted to add an explanation of here's why I assessed approval routing as low risk. If you wanted to have a rationale for your risk rating, we have comment sections that are editable by the end user after it's exported. You mentioned approval through VxT. Does that mean that it is routed within the customer website? No. Approval of the document that comes exported, it's a Word file. You would then either email it around to your team, your quality, your validation group, your project team, implementing master control or upgrading it, and it would follow your quality approval route. For some clients store their master control validation documents within their master control site, and you could always create an info card for your risk assessment. Others maintain their validation documents outside of master control, and it would follow whatever process that is. So it's your internal QMS approval process. If we are not using a feature in the documents module, such as like parallel approval, what do we do? You would mark your variance and best practice as NA and your regulatory sensitivity as NA. Right now, there's going to be what I call a feature in VxT that your client risk assessment cannot be NA, so you'll mark that as a 1. And you can just say any functionality that is marked as NA under variation from best practice, NA for regulatory sensitivity, and a 1 for client risk assessment indicates that this is outside the scope of our usage. There are some enhancements that are coming for VxT to make that more clear, and we'll be adding a not part of usage option. What has the experience been like for clients using this tool? We've gotten a lot of really great feedback. Most clients really enjoy this. It helps streamline and target their validation. It cuts down on how long it takes to do their validation. And I've also gotten a lot of enhancement requests. Our clients are brilliant and know what will make their lives easier. So we're hoping to have a 0.5 release of VxT come out soon of just some enhancements and tweaks like adding a comments row beneath each component so that you can say, here's my rationale for each of my assessments while you're putting them in, as opposed to waiting till the end and adding it as a comment at the bottom. What's the biggest advantage that clients are seeing using VxT? Time and energy. As we talked about in the presentation, the FDA has always pushed for a risk-based approach, and doing this functionality, using VxT actually gives you a documented, quantified, risk-based approach to your validation. So instead of running 120 pages of script per module, that we can cut that down and have it much more targeted to the actual feature risks that apply to your company and your company's usage. I am on-premise with master control. Can I still use VxT? Absolutely. Everything that supports VxT is available for download from the customer website. Our best practice zip file is part of our product downloads, the executed TPQ protocols. Can be downloaded from the customer web file. And VxT is on the customer website. You would just select your 11.7 instance, the 11.7 version, and perform your assessment. There is no barrier for our premise clients using VxT. The only barrier to usage is you have to be upgrading to 11.7 or implementing 11.7 for the first time. Are there any other questions or thoughts people wanted to share? We'll wait a few minutes to see if anyone wants to type in a last-minute question. Great. So after your baseline assessment, we get to our second change control portion. We're going to be doing a separate WebEx for that, or webinar for that. I believe it'll be a recorded webinar that you can download. And that'll be going through the change control portion. Once we set the baseline risk, the first time that you use VxT and we go through all of the components, we then can say, all right, what changed from, we'll say, 11.7 to 2017.2, or 2017.2 to 2018.1. And we can only look at those features that changed. So the change control portion is a much smaller risk assessment. The document that exports from that is a change control form. And so it will consolidate a lot of the validation deliverables into a single document to help with these kind of minor upgrades. But we'll be going through that through a separate webinar, so I don't want to go through too much detail on that one. Is the TPQ available in 11.7? Yes, absolutely. It's available from download from our products download. You select 11.7. It is part of the products downloads. Let me show you directly where. I'm logged into our customer website here. If we go to our Solutions tab and we select Product Downloads under Solutions Quick Links, and we select our version, 11.7. Under our product documentation folder, there is a TPQ validation zip. This will include all of the executed TPQ protocols for the 11.7 version. Another great question, how do I print this documentation for an audit? What's the best way to present it to an auditor? Same way that you would any of your other validation documentation. Once the document is generally finalized, has gone through review, and everyone's happy with their risk assessments, if you use a paper process for your validation documents, you would print it out, have everyone do a wet signature to approve it, and you would store it in your validation binder for your validation package for that version. And typically during audits, your CSV auditors will either ask for the final summary report, which details all of the validation activities that you took to validate the master control instance, or you just hand them the entire binder and wait for them to have questions. But usually keeping it filed with the validation package would be the best way. Another great question, are most folks defaulting to accept the master control TPQ protocols, and what kind of effort are you seeing being needed for PQ validation? That's a great question. I have seen a mix across the board. I think it depends a lot on your company's risk tolerance and trust in master control are the two variables that I have seen. The most often scenarios where additional usage testing is recommended through the tool is approval routing, and specifically for the documents and portal, is approval routing. So if you have a document, you want to make sure that all the steps of the document approval routing, so change request step, collaboration, parallel approval, escalation, review step, etc. Audit trail and eSig. Sometimes we'll see roles and users because people will consider those high risk because of the user authentication implications. But typically those are the common usage components. Myself and the services team are pouring through the data that's coming out of VxT right now, and we are beginning to draft up the common usage scenario testing that is recommended through VxT. So we will have templates that will cover the usage testing scenario, the most common usage testing scenarios that we're seeing being recommended through VxT, and be able to provide those to our customers as well. So I'll have a nice, neat little package for everyone. Can I use this for any module? What about quality event forms like CAPA Advanced or Complaints Essentials, etc.? So yes, with an asterisk and a caveat, all of our standard modules you can use VxT for. The only one you cannot use VxT is with our process module, which includes our quality event forms, kappa advanced, complaints, deviations, out of spec, nonconformance, et cetera, et cetera. The purpose of this is that we have many different client types of those forms. So we have our straight out of the box solution package. That is a pre-configured HTML form. You have the option to modify that and change the code of those forms through our solutions modification bundles, or you have the option to have something completely custom. Because there is the capability to do custom coding on those forms, it changes the GAMP category from GAMP 4 to GAMP 5, which changes the validation risks. So right now, those are outside the scope of VxT, and those would be handled through our traditional validation process. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you everyone for your time. Hopefully this was informational for you, and best of luck with your master control implementations and upgrades. If you have any further questions, please reach out to your CSRs and they'll happily guide you through this. Thank you.